As President Trump from the Oval Office said the Russia-Ukraine war could be over within a matter of weeks, we're trying to find out what that peace might look like. And Trump has been given a number of clues here in recent days about what it might be and what the overall terms may look like here. But we have to try and work through all of these words to try to figure out what it actually looks like on the ground. And trying to help do that, we have Colonel Doug McGregor back with us today, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, highly decorated combat veteran and good friend of the show. Doug, welcome back to the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.
Sure, Dan.
Always great to have you on here. Always a big fan favorite of our folks. They love it when you're on. And so we're really thrilled to have you on today, especially because Trump has been saying, and actually some of his senior administration officials have been saying in recent days, most recently on Sunday, I think it was, Carolyn Leavitt was answering questions for reporters out in front of the White House and said that a deal to end the war could come as early as the end of this coming week. And then on Monday, we had National Security Advisor Mike Waltz say also it could happen in a week or two. And then yesterday with Emmanuel Macron, he was asked how fast an end of war termination could come. Here's what he said.
I think the war could end soon.
Well, how soon?
Within weeks.
Weeks?
Yeah, I think so. Right? Don't you think so? I'd like to have you. I think we could end it within weeks if we're smart. If we're not smart, it'll keep going and we'll keep losing young, beautiful people that shouldn't be dying. And we don't want that. And remember what I said, this could escalate into a third world war. And we don't want that either.
Now, I want to ask you a couple of things about what he said there. You may recall that a week or so ago at the Munich Security Conference that General Keith Kellogg, Trump's envoy for the Russia-Ukraine war, had said that, and had been saying for about the 2 weeks before that, that he said he wanted this thing to end within 100 days. And he had himself a timeline set and he was going for it. And then now here's Trump saying a few weeks. So he seems to be thinking he's getting closer to the end. How do you read that comment on 3 weeks?
I'm not sure that I would attach too much significance to it. I think the most important thing at this stage of the game is that President Trump has announced he wants the war to end and he's willing to work towards that end with the Russians. That's very important. And he deserves eternal credit for that. The second part is he wants to normalize relations with the Russians. And there are a number of things underway, particularly in the private sector, that would involve U.S. corporations and companies coming back to Russia or coming to Russia for the first time to replace many of those European firms that pulled out. And that's fine. We should be doing business with the Russians and they should be doing business with us. That's all good news. But I think we have to be careful about the timetable. And I think Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, made that very clear in one sentence. Have you got that?
Yeah, this, if you could pull it up. Yeah. He was saying here that this quote was, the president clearly said that we are ready to negotiate with Ukraine, with Europe, with any representative who in good faith would like to help achieve peace. But we will stop hostilities only when those negotiations give a firm, stable results that suits the Russian Federation.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful summation. The Russians are in the driver's seat. They hold the initiative. They can do pretty much what they want to do. They've always had the ability to utterly crush and annihilate the Ukrainians anywhere they wanted to. And I think it was good of President Trump to point that out. He made that comment about Kyiv, that it would be very easy for the Russians to crush it, and they haven't done it. They don't want to do it. And this is something that we've lied about in misrepresenting the Russians, their interests, and their behavior. So I think we need to be patient. And then finally, you have this request or bid or offer of a new security architecture in Europe. That's extraordinarily important. That will take many months, in my judgment, to negotiate. All of those things are connected. How quickly this moves depends very heavily on the Russians and what they're comfortable doing. Remember, I know President Trump wants to do this, but you don't walk up and flip the switch in the room and say, well, the lights are on now. We're sorry about everything. It shouldn't have happened. So let's sit down and be friends. That might happen after a fist fight in the schoolyard, but that's not the way international relations work. The Russians are not going to take us very seriously until they see concrete steps. I think that's also implicit in the message that Sergei Lavrov gave. So we've got to build confidence in the Russians. We've got to signal our seriousness. And remember, I'm sure that President Putin remembers the cavalier way in which President Trump dismissed the INF Treaty when we unilaterally pulled out of it. That was something that really did not go down well in Russia. And if you look at the Oreshnik capability, the new missiles, the hypersonics, you look at those things, you can trace some of that back to the destruction of the INF Treaty. And I think the Russians would be open to resuming these things. They're not interested in spending themselves into oblivion, although admittedly they spend a lot less on defense than we do, and they get a much better return on the investment. But the bottom line is this could all take longer than everyone thinks. And we should be grateful and welcome any good news. But I think it's a mistake at this point to say weeks or months or days. Let's let it play out. Let's see where things develop, how far the Russians decide to advance, when they decide to stop. Let's also see what happens in Kyiv. Zelensky is talking about, voluntarily resigning. Great. The sooner he leaves, the better. We'll see what happens there as well. That all of these things have to be viewed against the backdrop of some sort of enduring and stable peace.
I want to pick up on something that you said there in your comments just a second ago, after I showed the Lavrov piece where he said it's going to be only when we are satisfied with the outcome, and it has to reflect that last phrase I didn't read out loud there, where he said it has to reflect the conditions on the ground. And we had a comment from Ryabkov, Sergei Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister, a week or so ago, where he said that all of the terms of Putin's 15 June from last summer, 14 June lines have to be accomplished. Otherwise, there won't be any deal made at all. Now, if you look on the lines of contact, there's a whole bunch of territory, especially in the three of the southern provinces that Russia has said that is necessary for the 14 June lines to be accomplished: Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Luhansk. And that means that Ukraine would have to voluntarily withdraw armored forces from that area, or the Russia would keep fighting. Now, where I specifically want to ask you is, there's been lots of debate among the West as to why Russia has still continued on with this methodical but pretty slow movement to the West, especially in the last month or so. It's kind of slowed down, implying that, well, Russia doesn't have the combat power to succeed. But if you look on Russian Telegram channels, some of the Russian military sites that are in Russian language, a lot of them are perplexed as to why they're doing that as well, because they claim they have the capacity. Now, I saw this today in it's called Military Review in Russian. This is translated by Google Translate. But they say that Russia has accumulated a reserve of 200,000 forces for an offensive in Kharkiv or Dnipro that they could run. This is on the heels of about a week ago. Zelensky himself said that there was 150,000 Russians up in the northern part that could come in, possibly in Sumy or also in Kharkiv. What do you make of the claim in the West that Russia can't fight harder than they have, and that this is all they can do at this slow pace?
Well, come on, this is a wasted time. Claiming that the Russians are incapable is an old song, or that they can't do something, or the government's not stable, or the population is not supportive. It's very tiring listening to all this nonsense. The truth is found on the battlefield. The Russians have moved deliberately and carefully. They've always moved within the framework of this air, space, and missile defense system umbrella that's designed to protect the ground force. They've always moved ground forces forward in a way that would limit casualties to the Russians and maximize casualties against the Ukrainians. Now, recently, because of the imminent collapse of the Ukrainian army, the vast numbers of people surrendering, the knowledge that at least 1.2 million or more Ukrainians are dead as a result of serving in this war, I think the Russians have decided that they want to reach a certain point before they will stop, and they're moving at their pace. They don't feel the need to rush anything at this stage. They've got the logistics built up. They have the railways. They have the lines of communication. So there's no reason to rush. However, and I think I said this a long time ago, if I were on the Russian general staff, I would argue very, very strongly for a line along the Dnieper River. I've always said that. If I were a Russian, historically, the Dnieper River has been the limit of advance for the West. That's where the West ended for hundreds of years. It's also a natural line of defense. It makes sense to the Russians, creates the desired buffer zone with the remaining territory being neutral. But I'm sure decisions have to be made about what else do we want to control before this ends. Kharkov was always a city that was Russian and Russian speaking, and the Russians want it. So I'm not surprised that we're going to see an offensive to take that. The second bit is to Dnipro, certainly. Dnipropetrovsk was the original name. That city is strategically key. That's understandable. The real question is, what about Odessa? I don't have an answer to that, and I don't think we'll have an answer until the Russians make up their mind. Now, the question for the Russians is, do they want Odessa in the hands of a neutral Ukraine that still harbors resentment, hatred, bitterness towards the Russians, that will utilize Odessa to introduce more arms than the Ukrainians are supposed to have, more munitions and so forth? I don't know what the Russians will do there. They could offer, to stay out of Odessa on the grounds that Odessa could be free and unoccupied militarily, as long as they had observers on the ground that could ensure that the ships were offloading or loading things that were not military in nature. I mean, there are different possibilities. On the other hand, they may go back and say, no, we want to make Ukraine a landlocked country. That's the only way we'll feel safe. I just don't know the answers to those questions. But I certainly think that this debate is occurring in the Kremlin. There are discussions, and I think we're just going to have to wait and see what they want. And we don't really know what was discussed between President Putin and President Trump, even though President Trump has allegedly said certain things, which again, I think is a mistake. Right now, I think we should all run silent, be grateful that we're within sight of the war's end, and that this is going to be negotiated in time, and we can begin withdrawing our forces that are wastefully deployed all along this line from the Baltic states all the way down along the Romanian border. It's crazy. We've wasted so much time and effort on this and money. This is a golden opportunity to get most of those forces out. That means most of 100,000 troops, Dan.
Yeah, that certainly is almost certainly on the table to be discussed, whether we want it to or not. I want to stick on the current line of contact first, and this report of those troops being massed. There's also another group that was alleged by the Ukrainian General Staff Intelligence Service, I guess, in December, that there was allegedly 150,000 troops on the other side, on the eastern side of the Kursk front, which had not yet been engaged. So apparently there's a number of groupings of Russian forces that are poised that they could engage, but they haven't. Now, I have been engaged with some folks who are trying to pierce together what the Russians may want. And there seems to be the theory that if Putin can get in negotiations with Trump all those June 15 lines and get the Ukrainian side to willingly withdraw back to those administrative borders, then he might be willing to have a deal with that. But that if not, if he can't get it on whatever timeline, and no one really knows, that these forces could then come into play and there could be a swamping of the Ukraine forces. How do you see that possibility?
No, I think that's eminently possible. And the Grand Mufti, who is the leader of the Islamic community in Russia, visited with President Putin recently, gave him a gift of a sword and a shield, beautiful, and said that the Islamic community stands 100% with Russia and behind him. But there was also an indication that there was a desire to wish him well with what looks like a coming offensive. So that may well be the case. And again, that's their call. They have to decide what they want to do. We all know when you're a soldier and you're at the end of a conflict, you have to ask the question, how much longer do we want to fight? Because no matter what the enemy does, however badly mauled the enemy is, you're still likely to lose more soldiers if you fight him. And you have to ask the question, how many more lives do I want to lose at this point? I'm sure President Putin does not want to lose more Russian lives. I'm also quite confident he doesn't want to unnecessarily kill more Ukrainians. But that's a judgment call. His generals have to confer with him. They have to make a decision. So I don't think we know at this stage. We really just don't know. But I'm sure we will find out in March.
And so let me ask you on the other side of that equation, what will be the pressures on Trump, and how could he navigate this if Putin does, if they get into actual discussions for end of war termination, and they said, okay, listen, you talk about you want some good relations after this is over. We do too. We want to normalize relations, et cetera. But to get this one off the table here now, we're going to have all these administrative borders. And if Trump says, okay, I'm not going to do that, I want this or that, and he doesn't give it, and then Putin says, okay, then we're going to take it, and he starts launching that offensive, how does Trump negotiate that? Because then that'll put him in a position to where he may look like he's losing control of it publicly on the battlefield to the Putin side. How can he navigate that?
Well, first of all, he can't lose control of something over which he exercises no control. I mean, this has been true from the very beginning. How many times have we discussed the reality that at this stage, we have no leverage? Whatever leverage existed, whatever real influence and power was still resident on the American side in Europe has been lost thanks to the Biden administration. They squandered everything. I mean, at this stage of the game, we don't have a leg to stand on. And anybody who looks at how our troops are strung out along this long border knows this is not a force that's capable of decisive operations. So who are we kidding? So I think President Trump has done the right thing. It's the courageous action to take. And only he could do this, I think. And he said, I want it over. I'm willing to end it now. And I'm talking to President Putin. He wants to end it. Let's let this go and see what happens. I don't think, we're going to end up in a situation where we're going to look bad or have egg on our face at all. I think the Russians are debating this. They're discussing it, and we have to give them time to do so. At the same time, this has liberated President Trump from the stupidity of waging war on Russia that's never really been our enemy, that we need to do business with. And that's a good thing. And so he's liberated us from this stupidity. He's turning his attention elsewhere. We have an enormous problem in the Middle East. It is rigged for an explosion on a scale that we haven't seen in 40, 50 years, probably longer. He knows that. We have a very fragile economy right now. We're doing everything we can. I know the president is and his administration to deal with it, but it's fragile. So these things are in the back, I'm sure, of his mind, and he's thinking about them. So getting Russia off the agenda is a very smart move on his part. And I think he'll be rewarded with it. I think the Europeans will be grateful in the long run.
I certainly agree with that. Anything that's going to get this off the table quickly that reflects the reality on the ground is going to be something. But there's some challenges here. Yesterday in Kyiv, there was a meeting of a lot of senior European leaders, and they were, basically talking like this is the third month of the war, not the third year of the war, and that they're still talking about, new sanctions on Russia, that they're going to give all these billions of dollars of additional aid, ammunition, weapon systems, et cetera, all being pledged today as though none of these peace talks are going on here. Then you got Zelensky himself, who was sitting at the head of that table, that, trying to kind of going, yeah, I got this going on. And he's made some comments that kind of contradicted some of the things that Trump has said, et cetera. The Secretary of the Treasury, Bissett, went to Kyiv, was summarily dismissed, didn't get the deal signed for the rare earths that Trump had declared that he wanted. And then now also yesterday, Trump is saying, oh, and by the way, I'm going to meet with Zelensky maybe later this week, and we're going to come to a deal. Watch this.
I will be meeting with President Zelensky. In fact, he may come in this week or next week to sign the agreement, and which would be nice. I'd love to meet him. Would meet at the Oval Office. So the agreement's being worked on now. They're very close to a final deal. It'll be a deal with rare earths and various other things, and he would like to come, as I understand it, here to sign it, and that would be great with me.
So is Trump trying, as best you can understand, is Trump trying to put pressure on Zelensky to say, basically, shut up, just get over here, we're going to sign this deal, I'm working something with Putin right now, or is he not reading the room and saying Zelensky's going to come when Zelensky's showing no interest in coming and signing a deal on rare earths?
I'm really quite shocked about Zelensky, and I'm also amazed at how polite President Trump is being. He's been remarkably polite. The truth is, Zelensky's no longer relevant. He needs to shut up and get off the stage as quickly as possible. The longer he stays there, the higher the probability that he doesn't live long. He needs to understand that. He needs to stop listening to the British and the French, who are feeding him a lot of nonsense and have no chance whatsoever of helping him, especially that principal clown in the European circus, Boris Johnson, who is recently in Kyiv again. Good Lord, it's appalling. The man's an ass. So Trump is going to do whatever President Trump wants to do. And President Trump is not an enemy of Ukraine by any means, but he wants peace and stability in Europe, and he's going to deliver it. And I think Putin is going to help him deliver that. Bojo from London isn't, and Macron in Paris is almost as irrelevant as Zelensky. It's unfortunate that we say that, but truthfully it is. He could have been much more relevant if he had taken a more strident position earlier against the stupidity, but he refuses to do that. So I think at this stage of the game, Zelensky's irrelevant. It doesn't matter what he says or does. And the British and the French need to go home, and they need to tell their troops to stand down. They're not going anywhere. No one wants them anywhere, least of all the Russians in Ukraine. So I think this war will end when the Russians are content and satisfied with what they've accomplished, when there are no longer any Nazis running around in eastern Ukraine, which is absurd. I think those things will happen. It will all end. But the British and the French are living in a dream world. They're behaving as though they are great powers. They really aren't. They're middleweight powers at this point. They don't have much in the way of armed forces. That's not our fault. That's theirs. And they need to understand that. It's getting to the point where if you have nothing to put on the table, then shut up and get out.
Okay, well, somebody who's not taken that advice is, besides the British and the French, is the Secretary General, the current Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, who yesterday had this strange thing to say.
Ukraine continues to endure with courage that does not falter, hope that does not fade, and a spirit that cannot be broken. NATO has stood with Ukraine throughout Russia's brutal war of aggression to keep the flame of freedom burning. We have kept Ukraine strong by providing arms, equipment, and training. The bravery and resilience of the Ukrainian people are an inspiration to the world. NATO will continue to support and stand with Ukraine and help it through the challenges ahead to ensure this war can end with a just and lasting peace.
I mean, what planet is this guy living on that he's talking about, all this heroism and all of this help that's going to continue on, and that somehow Ukraine will get to call the shots on ending the war? I mean, doesn't that put NATO in a position to where it could be undercutting its own credibility?
Oh, obviously, NATO is increasingly an empty facade. Once again, that's not President Trump's fault. That tragic outcome is a consequence of President Biden and these globalist fools that are still in power in places like Paris and London, and for that matter, even still in Berlin. And of course, Mark Rutte really needs to consider resigning. And if he feels very strongly about what he said, he should volunteer his services, get on a uniform, pick up a weapon, fly to Kyiv, and offer his services in the front lines. I don't see that happening, but that's what he ought to do. because what he's just said is just pure, unadulterated nonsense. There's nothing humane or democratic about Ukraine under Zelensky. Zelensky bans the largest Christian church in Ukraine. Zelensky puts people in jail at will. There is no habeas corpus. People are shanghaied into military service. Ukrainian secret police shows up and puts a bullet through anybody's head who refuses to comply. Zelensky is a little Stalin. The notion that anybody should lift a finger to defend this man and the disaster he's created is tragic and laughable. Ruta doesn't know what he's talking about. But
Well,
these people are going to bloviate no matter what. They're going to go down with the ship, believe me. And that's where they're on. They're on the Titanic, and they're standing on the bridge, and the water has reached them. They've had it.
And I've got to put this, because you mentioned a lot of this was really just fed and bred, and it's sustained in the previous administration, and some in the Democratic Party are still wanting to play that same song.
Let's not forget, America. Maybe there are some who say enough already. If we give in to Putin now, America will inevitably pay the price later. That's what history has shown. When you give in to thugs, when you give in to dictators, you pay the price. Hasn't Donald Trump and his allies learned the lessons of history? This struggle is in every way about the ultimate security of the American people.
You know what's sad to me, Doug, is I think he really believes what he said is true, that, oh my gosh, we can't let this happen as though we have a choice in it, because otherwise it's going to be Hitler and he's going to roll all over us. But golly, that's just so detached from any kind of reality. It's hard to even comment on.
Schumer and his colleagues lived perpetually in 1939. It's the old rope-a-dope strategy. Tell everybody that the opponent is Hitler, and that the world is at risk, and we must all marshal our forces and march against them. I'm sure we're going to hear something similar in the near future about the Middle East, in order to get everybody to mobilize and support the Israelis and the resumption of their campaign in Gaza and the opening of the new campaign in the West Bank and Iran and so forth. So this is all the same crap, frankly. Remember Lyndon Baines Johnson telling everybody, if we don't defeat these Viet Cong here in Vietnam, we'll be fighting them on the streets of Los Angeles. It's the same old mantra. It's all crap. Forget it. And my advice to Chuck Schumer, who's never served a day in his life in the military, nor, as far as I can tell, any of his relatives, perhaps he should think about exchanging his suit for a uniform and join Mark Rutte on the same airplane, and they can all fly to Kyiv and join this dying cause.
A great idea. Help the recruiting.
Go down with a ship. No one here will miss him.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. I bet if that was the case, that anyone who made those public statements would have to back it up with a rifle in their hands. Might change the narrative, I would say. Speaking of the narrative, I want to jump back into Trump's comments from yesterday and how this might end, because the comments were made in the context of Emmanuel Macron, who was in the White House, and he's been a big advocate of having French or British peacekeepers patrol any kind of settlement, almost like a North-South Korea kind of DMZ kind of a situation. He's talked about that a lot. One wonders if he had mentioned that in his conversation with Trump, because when in terms of a ceasefire, in terms of peacekeepers, Trump had this to say.
To accept the European troops as peacekeeper, would you think?
Yeah, he will accept that.
He will accept
I've
it?
asked him that question.
You talked to me?
I've asked him that question.
Is France
yes?
going to lift the block on the
Because
300
he's
billion?
not, look, if we do this deal, he's not looking for more war. He doesn't mind, but I've specifically asked him that question. He has no problem with it.
Yeah, and then afterwards, today, actually, the Russian media and then had referred to something that Sergei Lavrov had said earlier about peacekeepers, and this is Dmitry Peskov earlier today said that what Lavrov said on the 18th of February is still valid, which was, we were clear with our counterparts that President Putin has repeatedly emphasized that NATO expansion and absorption of Ukraine was a direct threat to the interest of the Russian Federation and our sovereignty. Considering this, the troops from NATO countries in Ukraine under a foreign flag, an EU flag, or any national flag does not change anything in this regard. This is unacceptable. So my understanding from some of the other things I've read is that Russia would theoretically possibly consider some kind of neutral troops if that was to their benefit, but under no circumstances would it be NATO people. So what do you make of Trump saying that Putin told him that it would be acceptable to them?
Well, I think that President Putin probably pointed out, and I think President Trump, for whatever reason, left it out, that European troops would be acceptable provided they were not NATO members. So if you take that seriously, you have the Austrians, for instance, who are still at least legitimately or legally neutral despite their leanings against Russia. You also have a similar phenomenon with the Swiss. They're still neutral, if not in practice, certainly in theory. I know that other things have been discussed, like troops from India that are experienced peacekeepers. The point is, I don't know that President Trump parsed his words as well as he should have, but I don't see any evidence that the Russians will back off of exactly what Peskov said and what Lavrov has said, and I'm sure Putin has said. If you're a NATO member, you don't send any troops into Ukraine under any circumstances.
Yeah, and what do you make about a report I read this morning that Turkey is apparently offering to the consideration of their troops as any kind of buffer troops there? And do you think that would be acceptable to Russia?
No, I don't think so. Not just because they're still NATO members. Obviously, the Turks can leave NATO. That might change the complexion of things. But the Turks have also supported Ukraine during this war with equipment and technology. So I rather suspect that would not be well received. There are other places they can go for peacekeepers if they need them. This is we need to go back to OSCE, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. They need to provide observers. I don't think the Russians will object to that, unarmed observers. Then you need to figure out who you're going to have in there, at least temporarily, to help maintain stability in Ukraine. Now, getting back to something else that Zelensky, this discussion with Zelensky very briefly, the Ukrainian people have had it with him. All these lies about how popular he is and has the support of the Ukrainian people are just that, they're lies. Ukrainians would like this to end yesterday, and they're sick to death of Zelensky. If you take away his British U.S. security force that surrounds him and protects him, these mercenaries, he's not going to be there for 10 minutes before he's offed. So I think we need to deal with the facts, and nothing this man says is true. Everything that comes out of his mouth is a lie. Ruda needs to wake up to that. Everybody in Europe does. This man is a total charlatan, and he's been part of the fool's play that has been running nonstop since February 2022.
I want to talk on one last thing that from this Trump meeting that he had here.
All journalists.
Yeah, that's some of the lies. By the way, this is what Gary's showing you right here is a video that Zelensky put out showing how heroic his country is and all this. I think this was either today or yesterday. A little bit slanted, we can say, which gives validation to what you just said, that it's all a bunch of lies. Last thing I want to talk about here is one of the last things that was mentioned in that conversation at the White House was that Trump was saying, hey, we want an end to war, but maybe we can just start with a ceasefire.
I'd like to go directly to an agreement, but ceasefire will always happen a little bit quicker. And every day you're saving thousands, or at least hundreds, but thousands in some cases lives. So we want to see if we can get that done.
But I think that one of those full screens I just showed you there was that Lavrov has said, no, we're not going to do that. They have been emphatic about saying that we will continue to fight until a sustaining agreement is done. Yeah, that's the one he said. He said, we will stop hostilities only when the negotiations give a firm, stable result. So that tells us that there's not going to be a ceasefire. Putin himself said there's not going to be a ceasefire. So when you hear Macron or Trump or any of these other people talk about a ceasefire, that may be historically common in these kinds of situations, but it doesn't appear that the Russians are going to do that. Why do you suppose that would be?
Why the Russians won't sign up for a ceasefire?
Right.
Because they haven't reached the finish line yet. Remember, they listed conditions. total denazification. In other words, the Ukrainian state has to be rendered incapable of threatening Russia. You know, those things haven't happened yet. The Ukrainian armed forces must be destroyed. And that's what's happening. The last remnants of it are being destroyed. And then finally, they need a new government in Kyiv. I wouldn't trust Zelensky and his little group any further than I could throw a grand piano. Why would the Russians? I mean, why would the Russians trust anybody, including us, given the way we've lied to them repeatedly, given what we heard about the Minsk Accords, thanks to Merkel, who opened her mouth and told the truth for a change. This sort of thing, we've got to come to terms with reality. This is about Russian national security. They have legitimate national security interests in Ukraine. They always have. We have legitimate national security interests in Mexico. And we're going to see those interests come into play in the future pretty quickly. And it'll be interesting to see how we react. I think we will react much as the Russians did towards Ukraine. The point is, nothing's going to happen until the Russians are confident and comfortable with the outcome on the ground. They're not there yet. They're not comfortable with the denazification. They're not comfortable with a number of these conditions. Again, that's why it's so important to get control of Ukraine, of the Kyiv government. The best thing we can do is to send Mr. Zelensky and his little inner circle away. I don't know if they want to bring back Zelensky, who's the former general that's currently sitting as ambassador in London. I don't know what they want to do, or whomever else they can find. But it needs to end, and it's not going to end with the people that are sitting in Kyiv. They've got to go away. And President Trump exerts enormous power in that regard. He can help remove these people and get them out of the picture. And then he can probably realize his aims much more quickly, because that would demonstrate conclusively to the Russians that we're serious. We're the ones who have run the show there. We're the ones that brought on this war. Remember that. And the Russians know it. And so they're watching to see what we do. Talk is cheap. Action is everything.
And of course, when I've asked you in the past, and I'd like to ask it in a slightly different way right here before we shift gears to a different topic here. I've asked you before, what would you recommend if President Trump were watching the show right now? What should he do right now, given this situation? I'll amend it slightly. Given where the Europeans are and how all of those comments that you may have read or the people have been talking about that European leaders said in Kyiv yesterday, that Zelensky keeps talking that we're not going to give up our land. We're still going to be able to have a negotiation, all kinds of stuff that's just disconnected from reality. But that's where they are, mentality. If Trump did what you have suggested, which is end our support, bring our troops home, and everybody who's over there, bring it out, and then submit to the June 15th lines, if I recall correctly, let me not put words in your mouth, then how would he navigate that, Trump, with the rest of Europe that wouldn't rupture in negative ways for the United States in relationships that keeps things going good for us?
You know, one of the things that could have been done that wasn't, and by the way, I understand how President Trump feels. You have to remember that when he was president during the first term, he was not treated well by the Europeans. And I think that there's a lingering sense of hurt and anger over that. And I wouldn't be surprised about it, especially when you look at this man Starmer and to a lesser extent at the French government. President Trump has a lot of influence, and I don't want to go into detail, but he can make it very clear what we will not do in the future if they do not cease and desist. Now, it would have been nice had the delegation that we sent to Saudi Arabia essentially decamped and went to Berlin, Paris, and London to address the Europeans in those governments directly and say, this is what we've discussed. This is what we have agreed to in principle. And this is what we're going to do next. That would have been helpful. We really didn't do that. And I understand why. But at this point, the Europeans, instead of seeing which way the wind is blowing and understanding that this war is going to end, and it's not going to end the way they want it to, it's going to end the way Moscow wants to end it. And we're prepared to accept that because, after all, they live there. Eastern Ukraine is next door. We don't. and we respect their wishes. I mean, that's really what President Trump has signaled. And if the Europeans aren't going to get on board, there are a lot of things that can be done immediately behind the scenes that could be, let us say, detrimental to the political careers of the people that are currently sitting in power in these capital cities. And President Trump knows that. And it's up to him whether or not he feels that he's got to do that to make his influence felt. Remember, Eisenhower had a disagreement with the British and the French and the Israelis in 1956. He made his influence felt, and everyone withdrew and got on side. We're still, vis-a-vis Europe, that powerful, and they know that, and it's in their interest to work with us, not against us. So Rutte needs to go. He should resign, and so should these people in London and Paris if they're not going to do what's in the best interest of their country. Again, all you have to do is look at the opinion polls. Remember that Vice President Vance made the issue. They're acting against the will of their people. He's absolutely right. The opinion polls are obvious. There's no one chomping at the bit in Northumberland or Wales or Cheshire, can't wait to get on the airplane, put on a uniform, and fly to Ukraine. I don't see anybody in Provence or the Vendée or anywhere in France that wants to do it either. So it's time to stop the nonsense. It's time to get back to business. And after all, rebuild the economies, which are now shattered as a result of these stupid policies. It's not the Russians that are standing in the way of that. They are standing in the way of it themselves.
Yeah, that is so true, and so much of this, I would argue that the vast majority of it is self-inflicted on the West of all the things we've done and how it's had negative boomerangs back on us, and hopefully we're at least nearing the end game. If we're not there yet, we're nearing the end state to where that's going to happen, and we'll finally get a chance to move on and rebuild from this. In the remainder of the time we have here, I want to look at a little bit because we hadn't had John since then. Pete Hegseth released a video about a week or so ago about some of the things he wants to do in the Department of Defense. Some of the things I think were good. Some of the things may be good, but I'm not sure about how to interpret some of the things he said, but I wanted to ask you your opinion on them. First one here is he's saying, hey, we're going to rebuild because that's what President Trump hired him to do, but he said there's going to have to be some difficult decisions made.
We're motivated to rebuild the most capable military in the world. That's why I'm here. That's what the president has asked me to do. But doing so does require tough decisions, and we are prepared to make them.
And just days after he made that video, you had the President Trump, in a nice way, but still, he fired the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General A.Q. Brown, and then right after that, Hegseth himself let 5 different generals go. We don't know if that's the end of it or where it's going, but first of all, just on these first levels of actually resigning 4-star generals, what do you think of it?
I think that anybody that you boot out at this point is a good decision. You know, we're at the end of a long period of what I would call core rot in the Department of Defense. We've got large numbers of people at the top who have no business being there. They should never have been promoted to the ranks that they hold. The steady deterioration from excellence to mediocrity that I've been watching over the last 30 years is just astounding. And we have clearly bottomed out. So whatever Secretary Hegseth wants to change is good. I'm 100% behind it. The one criticism I would level is this. We don't want to rebuild anything, Dan. We want to build a new force. This is a strategic inflection point in the history of the United States. This is a time where we need to bring the forces back, and we need to retread, reorganize, retrench. That means organize for a different war in the future and pay attention to our security here at home, principally the border with Mexico, but not just that, the borders, the coastal waters. You know, it's back to bring the Coast Guard back from the South China Sea. Ridiculous. Bring the Coast Guard back from the Indian Ocean. Ridiculous. Get focused on what really counts, and that's defense of our homeland. That has been ignored for far too long. But build a new force, and that can be done. Stop clinging tenaciously to the past. You know, there's this old expression from Peter Drucker. He said, people will always cling to the past and to the obsolete. They will never willingly march forward and adopt something new. The only way to get rid of the obsolete is to stop doing what you're doing. You know, one of the things that Secretary Hegseth and the new Secretary of the Navy ought to do is bring in a snapshot from the satellites regarding where all the ships at sea are in the United States Navy, surface vessels and submarines. They can do that. And then look at what the picture was 30 years ago. And I've actually participated in this, and I can tell you that picture hasn't changed much. And the real question is why? You know, I listened to someone today that said, we have to build a much bigger Navy. Really? Is that the answer? A bigger version of what we have? We're not about to fight Jutland. We're not about to fight Midway. This is a new world. Are these big surface capital ships really what we want for the future? I don't think so. It's as dumb as the idea that we ought to organize the army to deploy to the Eurasian continent and fight against the Russians or the Chinese or somebody else. That's crazy. Those days are over. We're never going to get across those oceans. The submarines will sink us. Missiles will sink us. We don't have to have surface vessels all over the world because we have satellite-based surveillance, reconnaissance, intelligence. We can find things out. What are we doing? Cutting squares in the ocean, in the Indian Ocean, waiting for what? It doesn't make any sense. We've got to sit down and take an honest look at ourselves. You know, the Marines have tried to do this. I think the outcome's been a disaster because there's also a tendency to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Oh, we don't need any more of X. No, that's not necessarily true. We may not need as many of X. We may need fewer, but we're still going to need a lot of X. And, you know, the Marine Corps, the heart of the Marine Corps, the backbone is the infantry. We need the infantry. That infantry needs to be part of the larger ground force. It is in France. It is in Great Britain. It's vital and essential that we have access to Marine infantry to cooperate with us, not be treated as a second army, but be seen as an integral part of the larger ground force that can perform that infantry mission. Now, that may involve a new organization, new kinds of capabilities, weapon systems. We can sort through that. But you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, we don't need that anymore, or we're going to turn everybody into a rocketeer. We have lots of platforms, undersea, submersible, surface, and airborne, as well as ground-based, that can deliver missiles. We don't necessarily have to have large numbers of Marines spread out all over the Pacific Ocean, waiting for the evil Chinese empire to strike west. I mean, this is just crazy. This is not 1942, not 1945. All of this has to be re-examined.
You've mentioned the Marine Corps and the Navy. In particular, I'd like your view on the Army, since you and I both served in the Army, and I know you've written books on all this, et cetera. One of the things that seems, you talk about obsolete and outdated. I know it was just in relatively the last couple of years or so that the Army said, you know what, we need to go back. We need to quit doing all this stuff, the organization for combat that we did during the counterinsurgency phase, et cetera. And we need to get back to peer-to-peer fighting. And to do that, we need companies, battalions, brigades, divisions, and corps headquarters, which is basically like we did in World War II, basically what we had in Desert Storm. Is that the right construct? And if not, what is the right construct?
Well, of course it's not. And there are lots of people in the Army that understand that. We're not going to refight the Second World War. We don't want to. And if we try to do it, particularly against the Russians, we'll be annihilated. You know, if you look at the density of force that was on the ground during World War II as it faced against the Germans, if we try to do that again, we'll stand by and watch rocket artillery, medium-range ballistic missiles, glide bombs, you name it, fly in and obliterate everything. The other point is we got to get out of this business of assuming the future will look like the past. The Army generals cling to all of this overseas presence, just like the Navy, the Army, the Marines, and the Air Force. If they lose their overseas presence, then what do? Well, how about defend the United States of America? I can come up with a good rationale for 500,000 troops, most 90% of whom are here inside the United States. They may be organized differently, may be equipped differently, and be capable of different things. But we have problems here inside the country, and we have them on our borders. The Army has a role to play. We need to look at our Guard and Reserve, and they need to mirror, in many respects, the regular Army. We've lost touch with all of these things, and we've worn a lot of people out. We've driven a lot of talent out. We've got to sit down and get back to basics and understand that our borders need protection, and we may have to fight in our hemisphere, not just along the border, but in other places. That's different from what we've been doing. And the same thing holds true for the Marine Corps. The future is bright if we're willing to step back and look at things differently. And by the way, we may have to get smaller first. And everybody resists this. Well, we have to have X number of hundreds of thousands of troops or we're at risk. Wait a minute. Not necessarily. We're not facing imminent existential threats from Russia or China. That's a lot of malarkey. We know that's not true. Our problems are largely south of the border and inside our own country. Now, we can deal with those, but we need to build a really good professional army. And that army needs probably to become smaller. And once you make it clear that we're not going to send people on pointless missions to places in the world that have no chance whatsoever of ever developing into societies like our own, but are going to wallow for many, many years in confusion, which is, by the way, their right to do. They have a right to their own culture, a right to the way they live. It's not our business to influence that. If we can accept that and get out of this, then I think we can build a very fine professional force that can do all of the things that we really need. But the notion that we should be prepared to go thousands of miles away from home and conduct campaigns on the scale of World War II, Korea, Vietnam, or finally Desert Storm, and what we've seen over the last 20 years is absolutely ludicrous.
Well, now, let me ask you, Doug, because one of the pushbacks to that has always been, oh, my God, you can't do that because now then you'll retrench. You just want to be a what is the term they always use? You just want to be pull back everywhere, and you're a surrender monkey. And if we did that, then everybody's going to take advantage, and the vacuum will be filled by Russia, by China, by who knows who, but it'll be our enemies, and they'll all be against us, and we'll just pull back into our little fortress Americana, and we'll be isolationist. What do you say to that argument?
Years ago, I had a friend who was a 3-star general. He was the director of the National Security Agency. And he was asked point blank the same kind of question. At the time, people were concerned about a Soviet military presence in Nicaragua. And this presents an existential threat to the United States. And he thought about it and he said, you know, if the Soviets really want to go into Nicaragua, we should consider sending a brigade of military policemen down there to direct traffic into the country. What a mess. What a disaster. Why would anyone in their right mind want to commit forces to these places? What are they going to do? And the answer is waste a lot of money, waste lives, alienate, and probably pointlessly kill and maim large numbers of people that live there. I mean, I've heard these arguments all the time. We heard it in Vietnam. We heard it subsequently. If we're not right there, ready to go, the world will fall apart. It's not going to fall apart, but the world is going to be different. And we've talked about that. We're talking about regional actors now coming to the fore. We see great power civilizations like Iran, India, China roaring back into focus and playing a role in the world. We need to get out of this business of thinking that we are the indispensable power. We aren't. The only thing that's indispensable to us is what we do here at home. We need to think of ourselves in those terms and stop wasting money, resources, and capabilities elsewhere. And if we are going to have alliances in the future, and I'm one of these people that thinks we should have little, what I would call, LLCs, limited liability partnerships with other countries. In other words, let's cooperate for this purpose. When that purpose is at an end, the cooperation doesn't need to completely end, but it certainly should end in a military sense. And the same thing is true with others. In other words, let's not fall into this trap that we've been in for so many years of trying to create these alliances that live on a hair trigger, designed to fight somebody somewhere. And then when they no longer have that mission, we try to breathe new life into the comatose body of the alliance like NATO and then use it for our purposes someplace else. You remember, NATO's either out of area or out of business. Well, I don't think most of those Europeans wanted to go out of area at all. So what have we done to them? Nothing good. And I think we have to back up from all of this and rethink what we're doing and who we are. It's very difficult because the biggest problem, Dan, this will disrupt, if not end, the money flow. And how do you justify all these crazy things if you're not going to get any money for it? Well, you're not. And I think President Trump has already talked about that when he said we'll cut our defense budgets in half. Obviously, he doesn't realize how much less everybody spends than us. But I think the Doge crowd is going to find that out. I don't know how much will work because, again, first you have to change the strategy, then you build a new structure. This is the time for that. This is the ideal time in the history of mankind for us to do that. We don't want to miss it.
Yeah, truly. I would argue, Doug, that if we get everything with the Russia-Ukraine war off the table, in the threat of any clash between the Russians and the United States and or Europe, that's the perfect time to actually get in some of these reforms you said, because now then you have the strategic vulnerabilities are less and the opportunity to do that. We'll see if it actually takes care of that.
Yeah, and by the way, Dan, I think President Trump can achieve that with the Chinese, particularly if it works with Moscow. I think that opportunity will present itself. Right now, people don't understand in the United States that most people beyond our borders want nothing to do with a war.
Yeah.
They just don't. If you visit China, you visit Korea, visit Japan, and see the monumental buildings these people have created, the societies that they've created. They're very different from us, but they work. They're very good. They're very effective. They're not interested in putting all of that at risk. Anybody who thinks so is absolutely deranged.
Yeah, and we certainly don't need to be going down that path anyway. Last thing here in the last few minutes that we got here, I wonder if you can talk about a show that you've got coming on next month. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, we originally wanted this to come out on the 11th of March. I think it's going to be a little later. Everything takes longer than you think, Dan, as you well know. But this is, I think the current preference is to turn it into McGregor's Focus on America. Right now they're calling it McGregor, but I think we'll end up talking about the Focus on America. And we want to cover a variety of topics. Most will be domestic. There will be talk about foreign and defense policy. And if we have conflicts and crises in the near future, and I fully expect that we will certainly cover those things. But we want to talk about health, food production. We want to talk about medical care. We want to talk about all the things that are important to the American people. And to the extent that we can, we want to go out there and meet with Americans and talk to them and listen to what they have to say and get those Americans engaged so that they can be seen and heard by their countrymen. So that's where we want to go. I think it'll be a hit with people, but we'll see. You never know until it hits the screen and the viewer gets a vote. So we hope they'll vote in favor.
Well, we certainly do. I hope they do, and we'll definitely be given a vote for that, and we'll promote that every chance we get because I think it's a great idea. Thank you so much, Doug, for coming on and sharing that, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time and on your show.
Super, absolutely, and you'll be there, believe me. Thank you, Dan.
Look forward to it. Thank you very much, and thank you guys too. We always value you when you're here on our own show, so be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't done that before you leave. It helps us a lot more than you may think. And we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.